In April 2022, Sri Lanka ran out of money. Not metaphorically, literally. The government couldn't buy enough fuel to keep hospitals running, couldn't import enough food, couldn't pay the interest on its own debt. For the first time in the country's independent history, Sri Lanka defaulted. People waited in lines for days just to buy cooking gas. Inflation blew past 70%. Protesters stormed the president's residence and swam in his pool on live television. And within weeks, he'd fled the country. It was, by almost every measure, one of the worst peacetime economic collapses in the world in the last 2 decades. So here's the question everyone keeps asking. 4 years later, is Sri Lanka actually back? And the honest answer is more unsettling than a simple yes or no. On paper, the numbers look almost unbelievable. Inflation, which was above 70% at the peak of the crisis, has collapsed all the way down to around 2 to 3%. The economy grew by roughly 5% in 2024, beating the IMF's own projections. Tax revenue, once one of the weakest in the region relative to the size of the economy, has more than doubled as a share of GDP. Foreign currency reserves, which hit almost zero during the crisis, have rebuilt significantly. An IMF official stood in Colombo earlier this year and said in plain terms that the economy has stabilized decisively across growth, revenue, and inflation all at once. If you only read the headline statistics, this looks like one of the great economic turnaround stories of the decade. But statistics measure averages, and averages hide people. Because underneath all of that recovery, poverty in Sri Lanka has remained stubbornly, brutally high. The same institutions celebrating the macroeconomic turnaround are in the same reports admitting that ordinary living standards haven't caught up to the recovery on paper. A shrinking economy doesn't hurt everyone equally, and neither does a recovering one. When subsidies were cut and electricity and fuel prices were forced up to satisfy IMF conditions, the people who felt that pain first were the ones with the least room to absorb it. And 4 years later, many of them still haven't gotten that ground back, even while the national growth chart points confidently upward. And the recovery itself was never built on Sri Lanka's own strength alone. It leaned heavily on outside support. India stepped in early with a rescue package worth over $4.5 billion, fuel, food, medicine, credit lines, just to keep the country's supply chains from collapsing completely during the worst months. The IMF structured a nearly $3 billion 4-year bailout, its 17th program with the country overall, tied to painful conditions: subsidy cuts, tax hikes, cost-reflective energy pricing. And Sri Lanka had to sit across the table from bondholders and major creditors, including Japan, China, and India, and renegotiate roughly $25 billion in debt just to make the repayment schedule survivable. Every piece of this recovery was borrowed, negotiated, or donated. None of it was organic growth built from a healthy, diversified economy standing on its own. Which brings us to the part of the story most headlines skip entirely. The debt itself never actually went away. Even after years of reform and restructuring, Sri Lanka's debt-to-GDP ratio still sits above 100%, meaning the country owes more than its entire economy produces in a year. Projections show that ratio only easing down toward the high 90s by the end of the decade, and only if the government keeps hitting demanding fiscal targets without a single major shock along the way. And there's a specific date hanging over all of this: 2028, when a wave of major debt repayments comes due. Analysts are already asking the uncomfortable question: Will Sri Lanka's rebuilt foreign reserves actually be enough to cover it? Or is the country walking calmly toward a second cliff edge just further down the road? Then, at the end of 2025, reality delivered a preview of exactly how fragile this all still is. Cyclone Ditwa tore through the country, killing more than 600 people and displacing over 100,000 more. It devastated infrastructure and livelihoods right as Sri Lanka was in the final stretch of completing another critical IMF review. The government was forced to divert money earmarked for fiscal discipline into emergency recovery instead. The IMF pushed back its review timeline, and growth projections for 2026 were cut down to around 3%. One storm, not a war, not a global recession, just one storm was enough to knock the recovery off its stride and force the country to lean on emergency financing all over again. That's the real lesson sitting underneath the Sri Lanka story, and it's more important than any single statistic. This isn't a country that failed to recover. It's a country that recovered exactly the way the international financial system is built to make possible, through emergency loans, debt restructuring, and painful austerity, while the debt-to-GDP ratio stayed dangerously high and poverty stayed dangerously unsolved. Sri Lanka proves that a country can hit every macroeconomic target the IMF sets for it and still be one bad harvest, one currency shock, or one cyclone away from finding itself right back where it started. The crisis is technically over. The vulnerability that caused it never actually left.